Can you understand this Buddhist paradox? Most don't. Ajaan Suwat used to like to point out a paradox in the Buddha's teachings. On the one hand, there's the teaching that, as we chanted just now, form, feeling, perceptions, thought fabrications, and consciousness are all not self. The 6 senses are not self. The eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind are not self. But then, as he pointed out, there's the phrase, another passage that we chant again and again, I am the owner of my actions. The question is how to resolve the paradox. We have to note that it's there in the Buddha's teachings, as well as in the passage we chanted just now, where the Buddha talked about the aggregates being not self. But then there are other passages where also talks about taking the self as your mainstay, as your refuge. Take the self as your governing principle. Remind yourself if you're ever tempted to leave the practice that you got onto this path because you loved yourself. You didn't want to suffer. You wanted to put an end to suffering. And if you abandon the path, is it because you want to continue suffering? Do you not love yourself anymore? If you have any concern for yourself, you want to stick with the path. There's also a passage where Ananda says that it's necessary to have a sense of conceit, which basically means your sense that I am. Even though we're here ultimately to put an end to conceit, we use conceit to do it the sense that other people are capable of following this path. They're human beings, I'm a human being. If they can do it, why can't I? You need that conceit in order to practice. So what's going on here? First, we have to remember that the Buddha never taught that there is no self. You can't find that statement anywhere in the canon. He talked about not self, and he described certain things as being not self. Secondly, he never called not self a characteristic. Sometimes we hear that the Buddha taught the 3 characteristics of inconstancy, stress, and not self, but he never called them characteristics. He called them perceptions. Perceptions of self and not self. That should alert you right there. Something is up. Self is a perception. Not self is also a perception. And it's not the case that one of those is a conventional truth and the other an ultimate truth. Everything you say is a convention. Every perception is a convention. And these conventions have their uses at different times and places in the practice. It's good to see the perception of not self and the perception of self as value judgments. In other words, is something worth holding on to, worth identifying with? If so, when and where? How about things that are not worth identifying with? Again, when and where? After all, not all the Buddha's teachings are meant to be used all the time. There are only 2 teachings that he identified as categorical. One is the principle that skillful action should be developed and unskillful action should be abandoned. The other is the 4 noble truths. The first truth is the truth of suffering, which is clinging to the 5 aggregates of form, feeling, perceptions, fabrications, and consciousness. There's a duty with regard to that truth, which is to comprehend it, in other words, to understand it to the point of having no more passion, aversion, or delusion around suffering. The second noble truth, the cause or the origination of suffering, consists of 3 kinds of craving for sensuality, for becoming, for not becoming. The duty there is to abandon the craving, in other words, to develop dispassion for it. The third noble truth is the cessation of suffering, the fact that suffering does end when you abandon the cause. The duty there is to realize it, in other words, to have a direct experience of it. And finally, the 4th noble truth is the path that allows you to abandon craving. That's the noble 8-fold path. The duty there is to develop it. These 4 noble truths are true all the way across the board. The question is, when and where do the perceptions of self and not self fit into those truths that are true across the board? The first thing to notice is the definition of suffering, the act of clinging to those 5 aggregates that we chanted about. When they're not clung to, they're not going to create a burden on the mind. That means that the issue is the clinging. You have to remember that the passage we chanted just now was delivered to a group of monks who had already heard the first sermon the Buddha gave, describing the 4 noble truths and their duties. So they were alert to the fact that the problem was the clinging to the aggregates. The problem was the craving. They still had some clinging. They still had some craving. So the purpose of the second sermon, which is what we chanted just now, was to help undo that clinging to, undo that craving. Look at all the things you might cling to and realize they're not really under your control. They change. They're uncertain and inconstant. Sometimes that word anicca is translated as impermanent, but it's not precisely what it means. It means to be inconstant. It's unreliable. So your body is unreliable. Your feelings, your perceptions, your thought constructs, and your consciousness are all unreliable. So if these things are unreliable, why do you want to continue to cling to them? The answer usually is, what else is there? If you can't hold on to them, what can you hold on to? And the response to that, of course, is, why do you have to hold on to anything? How about a happiness that doesn't require holding on? As the Buddha said, when you see that that's a possibility, you see that these things are not worth holding on to. You let go. Then there's the experience of the deathless. All those monks who were listening to this discourse had had that experience. They'd had their first taste of awakening, so they had that point of comparison. But they still had some residual clinging, so that had to be taken care of. So the Buddha went over these 5 aggregates again, saying that even in their subtle forms, you have to let them go. But as for the question of whether there really is or is not a self, that was a question the Buddha put aside. He had a policy. There were 4 ways that he would respond to questions. One was to give a categorical answer to the questions that deserved that type of answer. In other words, an answer true across the board. Second would be questions that deserves an analytical answer, where he had to redefine the question before he could answer it. Third was cross-questioning. He questioned the understanding of the person asking the question before giving the answer. And then the 4th were the questions he simply put aside because they were not worth answering. You probably know that passage in the canon where the Buddha compares certain questions to the questions that a person might ask a surgeon. A man has been shot by an arrow in a battle. They carry him to the surgeon who's going to take the arrow out. But the patient says, "Wait a minute. Before you take out this arrow, I want to know who shot the arrow. I want to know what feathers it was made of, what wood it was made of, and who made it." As the Buddha pointed out, if you try to answer all those questions, the man would die first. The questions simply get in the way of putting an end to suffering. And it turns out that of those 4 types of questions, the question of, is there a self or is there no self, was a question the Buddha put aside. It wasn't worth answering. He did that twice, once when he was asked directly by a wanderer from another sect, and then another time when he was talking to a group of monks, saying that questions of who am I, what am I, do I exist, do I not exist, are all not worthy of attention. Then the question, of course, is which questions are worthy of attention? The answer is those that deal in terms of the 4 noble truths. What is suffering? What's the duty with regard to it? What is its cause? What's the duty there? And so on. So those are the questions that the perceptions of not self and the perceptions of self are supposed to help answer. There was a time when the Buddha was talking about not self, and a monk came to the conclusion, well, if, form, feeling, etc. Are not self, then what self is going to be affected by what's done by things that are not self? In other words, he changed the teaching to a metaphysical one. There's no one doing the action, no one to receive the results of the action. The corollary to that, of course, is that you can do anything you want because you can't be held responsible and there's no one there to complain about how you treat them. The Buddha came down really hard on that monk. That was not the proper use of the teaching on not-self. Instead, its purpose is to help develop dispassion, to help let go of your clinging. We're not here to decide whether or not there is a self. We're here to cure the problem of suffering. As long as you need a sense of self to develop the path, you use it. You use the perception of not-self to disidentify with things that would pull you off the path. Like you're doing right now, you're responsible for doing the concentration. You can't say, well, the concentration is not self, so I'm not responsible. I'm just watching it happen. You have to do it. It's something you develop. That's the duty there. So you accept that responsibility. The self along the path functions in three ways. There's the self as the producer who actually does what needs to be done. That's the agent. Then there's the self as the consumer, the one who's going to reap the rewards. Finally, there's the self as the commentator who comments on what the producer's doing and judges whether it's good enough or could be improved. These are the selves that you have to rely on, that are your mainstay as you practice. But as you get better and better at the concentration, better and better at discernment, there comes a point where you begin to see that these perceptions of self are no longer needed. That's when you apply the perception of not-self, even to elements of the path. Both perceptions are strategies for the sake of putting an end to suffering when you use them right. Even in everyday life, your sense of self is a strategy for happiness, and you already have a sense of not-self that you use strategically as well. There are certain things you just don't identify with. A thought comes into the mind, it's something that you wouldn't want to do, and you know it gives bad results, so you say, that's not anything I want to get involved with. That's a perception of not-self. As for things that you do want to do and you know will give good results, you identify with them. That's a thought I want to take on. I want to adopt that thought. So you're already using these perceptions as you need them. There comes a point in the practice, though, where you don't need the perception of self anymore. That's when you use the perception of not-self across the board. But that doesn't mean you arrive at the truth that there is no self. After all, not-self too is a perception. It's something you've got to let go of. It's one of those aggregates that if you cling to it, is going to keep you suffering. So ultimately, you let go of both perceptions. Nibbana was self or not self. There was a time in Thailand years back when there was a controversy over whether Nibbana was your true self or not. The controversy started in monasteries and then it spread, if you can imagine, into the newspapers. It was everywhere in the country. Imagine a tabloid newspaper in the United States debating the issue of whether Nibbana was self or not self, asterisk, the New York Daily News, the New York Post, asterisk. Well, that's what you had in Thailand. So someone asked Ajaan Maha Boowa whether Nibbana was self or not self, and he said, Nibbana is Nibbana. When you get to that point, you don't need the perception either of self or not self because they're just perceptions. You've got to let go of them. Or as Ajaan Suwat once put it, when you arrive at Nibbana, you arrive at the ultimate happiness, and it's so total that you don't even care to ask the question of whether there's anybody experiencing it or not. The experience itself is so total, so satisfying that it puts an end to all questions of that sort. So we're not here to see that there is no self. Sometimes you have experiences in meditation where you can convince yourself that you've seen that there is no self, but what kind of experience would actually confirm that what you can see is when you use the perception of self? What happens? Is there suffering? Is there not? When you use the perception of not self, is there suffering? Is there not? And to what extent do these perceptions help you develop the path, help you take on the duties of the Four Noble Truths and get rid of whatever clinging you have? No matter how you identify yourself around the aggregates as a permanent self or an impermanent self, a separate self or a connected self, an infinite self or a finite self, Any way you might identify self around those aggregates will eventually cause suffering. But sometimes you have to take on some of the suffering of holding on to an idea of self in order to do the path. But then, when the skill is mastered, you can let it all go. After all, that's what we're here for, not to answer the question of whether or not there is a self, but to answer the questions of why is there suffering and what can be done to put an end to it. Those are the questions worth asking. It's through the meditation that you answer them. And you'll know for yourself when you've had that experience when everything falls away outside of space and time, something that can be touched as you work here in the present moment and opens up outside of the present moment. That can confirm, yes, there is no suffering there. That's a question you can answer. So, to whatever extent you need the perception of self to get there, use it. When the time comes to put it aside, use the perception of not self, and then put that aside as well. That's when you've accomplished what the Buddha's teachings are all for. Not self in context. One of our problems as Westerners coming to Buddhism is that we tend to want to jump to the high-level teachings right away before we're ready for them. Ajaan Lee, for instance, warns against jumping to the issues of inconstancy stress and not self before you're ready for them. As he said, the Buddha started out by taking what was inconstant in his mind and turning it into something constant, in other words, creating a state of concentration. He took what was stressful and turning it into ease. He took what was not self and bringing it under his control. It's only when you've done that that you're ready to take on the teachings of inconstancy stress and not self on a subtle level where they really do make a difference in the mind, really do give rise to dispassion. But first, you have to be passionate about training the mind. The dispassion in the beginning has to deal with things that you find are going to pull you away from your concentration. So if you're going to use the contemplation of inconstancy stress and not self, now apply it to what's pulling you away. Thoughts about yesterday, thoughts about tomorrow, thoughts about food, clothing, shelter, and medicine, thoughts about people. Those are things you want to be dispassionate for, but you want to be passionate for the object of your meditation. So focus on the breath. Learn how to be passionate for the breath. If the level of ease in the breath is not very constant, try to make it more constant. See how you can bring this under control so that the mind is willing to settle down with it. Bringing the breath more under control, you bring the mind more under control as well. In other words, the first order of business is to learn the skill of meditation. And then the teachings on inconstancy stress and not self come in as part of that skill. You see the same pattern in the Buddha's teachings to the five brethren. The discourse on not self was the second discourse, it wasn't the first. In that discourse, the Buddha gives two arguments for why the aggregates should be seen as not self. One is that you can't really control them. You can't tell them not to grow old, you can't tell them not to get sick, you can't tell them not to die. The second argument is, if these things are inconstant and stressful, is it worthwhile calling them self? In other words, this is a value judgment. He's not asking the five brethren to come to the conclusion that there is no self. He's just asking that when you see that your body is inconstant or your thoughts are inconstant, in other words, they're not all that reliable, are they easeful? Well, no, they're not easeful. If things are not really easeful and inconstant, are they worth calling yourself again? No. That's the second argument, and that was the argument that led them to awakening. But before bringing up the topic of not self, he started the first sermon, setting the wheel in motion with the discussion of action. What's the path of practice that's noble? There are two ignoble paths. There's the path of indulging in sensual desires, and there's the path of self-mortification, neither of which is noble. Then the Buddha says there is this middle way that is noble and does lead to awakening. So the Buddha set the five brethren onto the noble path before saying anything about not self at all. First, he got them to develop their actions. As we know from other suttas, the Eightfold Path is a path of action that leads to the end of action, in other words, to a state of mind that's not created. But you've got to do the action to get there. So the context here is action, and trying to find a skillful action that leads to good results. And action, of course, implies a certain amount of control. You do want to have some control over your views, your resolves, and all the way to your concentration. So you work on that first. It's important to keep this sense of the right context in mind. Because all too often you hear people starting with the idea that the Buddha taught there is no self, and then the question comes, well, he's teaching karma and rebirth. So if there's no self who does the karma, who receives the results of the karma, what gets reborn? And there's a conflict. But you reverse the context. The Buddha started with action, teaching a path of action. And then, after having established that, having gotten people on that path, then he raised the issue of self. What kind of action is self? In the case of the five brethren, they were all already stream enterers before he raised the issue of not self. In other cases, we know that he taught people that there are times when you want to hold on to a sense of self. You sense a you here meditating, so make sure that the you here is doing it well. Other people can do this, so can you. Having that attitude, it counts as conceit, but it's a useful kind of conceit. It's necessary for succeeding at the path. And there's a question: do you really love yourself? You came here to do this practice. When you feel tempted to stop, ask yourself, okay, you came here for this purpose, which is to put an end to suffering. Do you not want to do that? Don't you really care for your genuine happiness? It's in cases like that where the activity of identifying yourself is actually useful. So taking action as the context, you begin to see self and not self as activities. And then the question is, when is it skillful to have a particular sense of self, and when is it not? When is it more skillful to apply the perception of not self? And this is it. When you're starting out here, the affairs of the world are at this moment not your business and none of your affair. They're not your friends right now. So put them aside, put them aside. Try to get on friendly terms with the breath. Have some sense of control. Telling yourself to stay with the breath is an area where this particular sense of self is a skillful activity. There are times when not self is also a skillful activity. So you learn how to use these perceptions when they're appropriate. Ultimately, when you let go of everything, you let go of even the perceptions of self and not self. But in the meantime, as long as you're on the path, you learn how to use them well. So remember, the path comes first, and passion for the path comes first. Don't let yourself short-circuit everything by trying to go for dispassion right away. The things you hold onto Ajaan Maha Boowa's image is of a ladder. You're climbing a ladder up to the roof of a house. You don't just let go. You hold on to one rung and then you grasp the rung that's higher than that. And then you let go of that lower rung and use that hand to grasp onto the higher rung. And you keep going up this way. You don't let go of the ladder until you're up on the roof. And it's the same with our practice. You want to develop a healthy sense of self. You can't avoid that. Many people want to bypass this issue of straightening out their sense of self by going straight for no self or not self. But it doesn't work. You have to go through the process of seeing what kind of selfing is skillful and what kind of selfing is not, and when it's skillful, when it's not. What kind of not selfing is skillful, and what kind of not selfing is not. When is it skillful, when is it not? You realize you that have choices for applying these perceptions, and you want to do it well. As you get more sensitive to these choices, you get more and more appreciation for the freedom you have to choose. Then you begin to realize there are other choices that you wouldn't have imagined if you hadn't cleared these things up first. So, right now, your choice is, where are you going to focus? Okay, focus on the breath. What are you going to do with the breath? Try to make it comfortable. Once it's comfortable, what are you going to do? Well, see if you can maximize that comfort, make it steady, and then allow it to spread so that the whole body feels good as you breathe in, breathe out. These are your choices right now. As you pursue the right choice, that opens up other alternatives, new possibilities for choice. And among them will be when you get a sense of what kind of self you're creating as you meditate. When is it useful? When is it not? You have choices here too. It's by making the right choices that better and better choices become available. So follow this issue of trying to be skillful in your actions as passionately as you can. Start with the path. And as for issues of self and not self, learn to use them as you're mastering the skills of the path. Putting things in the right context can make all the difference in the world. Not self is a value judgment. When the Buddha taught breath meditation to his son Rahula, he prefaced his teachings with some contemplations that provided groundwork for breath meditation. One of the contemplations is not self, which may seem surprising because we usually think of the not self teaching as something designed for the last stages of the path. And it is true that when the Buddha taught people to let go of everything to learn to identify nothing at all as self, he was speaking largely to people who were on the verge of becoming arahants, people who'd followed the path, all the activities of the path, and now were ready to let go of those activities and any sense of self that lingered around them to reach a state of mind that was beyond activity. But even at the beginning of the path, it's useful to learn how to apply the reflection on not self in a more selective way. In brief, the Buddha's trying to get us to see our sense of self as an activity. We do identify with things, and our sense of identity changes all the time. We pick up something and identify with it, and then we drop it to identify with something else. The dropping, which is an act of not selfing, is also a type of activity. You want to learn how to see how it happens while it's happening. All too often, we don't see it because we're so intent on moving on to the next sense of self and then the next. What happens in the process of letting go of something you used to identify with, that's something you want to look into and to take advantage of as you meditate. As you're sitting here, you could take on lots of different identities. The identity you want right now is the identity of a meditator, an earnest meditator. You're here really trying to get some genuine results from what you're doing. But there are a lot of other identities lurking in the background of the mind. The identity of you at work, the identity of you at home, the identity of you as a feeder, as an enjoyer of sensual pleasures, all kinds of identities that you could take on right now. For the time being, at least you have to learn how to not self those identities. See that they're not worth taking on. That's what the whole idea of self and not self is based on. It's not so much a metaphysical issue for most of us. It's a value judgment. And that's how the Buddha wants us to see it, as a value judgment. Is this particular self worth taking on, or is it not? Is a particular identity something that's really worth following through? The same questions apply to the actions that you take on when you assume that identity. Are they worth it? This sort of calculation is something we're doing all the time, whether we're conscious of it or not. I was talking this morning with someone who was commenting on how the not-self teaching seemed very rarefied. I told him, look, you're not selfing all the time. As you take on an identity, say at work, you take on your work identity and drop the identity you take on at home. Even when you're at work, you can drop your work identity as you start thinking about other things that are not related to your work. Then when you realize you've got to get work done, you take your work identity back on again, along with every issue of craving and clinging with which this sense of self is tied up. When the Buddha talks of the third noble truth, he says he wants you to see the mind as it lets go of craving and to realize the good things that come about when you let go of that craving. But ordinarily, when we let go of one craving, we get so wound up into moving on to the next craving, and then the next, that we don't see the process of letting go. So as you meditate, And this is why this is a preliminary contemplation. You want to get good at that ability to realize that you've taken on an identity, and if it's not something you want, you cannot self it. You have better identities to choose from. If you find yourself suddenly wandering off into the past by means of a little thought world, well, pull yourself out. This ability to pull out of an identity is a lot of what not self is about, pulling out of those thought worlds. You see that the thought world and your identity in the thought world isn't worth it. And of course, there'll be a voice in the mind that says, "Come on." Yes, it is. This is where you need a sense of values that enables you to decide whether you can trust that voice or not. Gaining a sense of values is one of the main points of the not-self teaching. What is your sense of values? What's important for you? Which identities do you want to develop? Which identities are worth developing? This is why the Buddha has us look at the arising of a sense of self, the passing away of a sense of self, the allure of a particular sense of self, and then the drawbacks of that sense of self so that we can get beyond it. That's the same pattern of inquiry that he has us adopt for every activity, skillful and unskillful. There are times when you drop unskillful activities for the sake of skillful ones, and then you drop certain skillful activities because you want to move on to something even more skillful. When you gain a sense of awareness and fluidity around this, you learn how to do it more skillfully. If you find yourself stuck in a bad identity, you know there are ways of getting yourself out. So when the Buddha's teaching not self as a preliminary contemplation, it's like the first step they teach you in Thai boxing. Before they teach you how to hit or kick, they teach you how to back away from your opponent without exposing yourself to his kicks. In other words, retreat is the first thing you want to learn. And the same principle applies in meditation. You're going to be sitting here, meditating, focused on the breath, and all of a sudden the breath seems far away and you're in some other thought world. You want to be quick to recognize that and quick to see the disadvantages of staying with that thought world, and then retreat from it. Let it go. There are other identities, of course, that you want to develop. Sitting here as a meditator, you want to be a good meditator. When you're at work, you want to be a good worker. If you're a part of a team, you want to be a good member of the team. In other words, realize that the identities you take on are choices you make. And you want to ask yourself what choices will be for my long-term welfare and happiness. When you start thinking of selfing and not selfing as activities, you realize that they fit right in with the Buddha's teachings on karma. Basic wisdom around karma starts with the question, what when I do it will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? Well, insert the term selfing and not selfing in that question. What ways of selfing and not selfing will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? What ways of selfing and not selfing will lead to my long-term harm and suffering? That's the beginning of wisdom around the issues of self and not self. So learn to see the choice to self or to not self as it happens as you take on or drop an identity, either as the potential consumer of some happiness or as the person with the skills and abilities to bring that happiness about. See all that as a type of activity, as a type of karma. Then ask yourself, when is it skillful? When is it not? What types of selfing are skillful? When is it worth doing? When is it not? Again, not self is a value judgment. The Buddha's not asking you to draw conclusions about whether or not there is a self in the larger metaphysical sense. Even when he was talking to people on the verge of becoming arahants, giving them that questionnaire, notice how he phrased the questions. Form, feeling, perceptions, fabrications, consciousness. Are they constant or inconstant? They're inconstant. If they're inconstant, are they easeful or stressful? They're stressful. And then the final question is not. Then, is there a self? No, the question is, are things that are inconstant and stressful worth holding onto as self or as being claimed as me or mine? The answer is no. It's a value judgment. So get your values straight as to which of your identities you want to take on and which ones you don't. Learn to see your identity as something fluid, moving and changing its shape all the time, like an amoeba, sometimes looking like a horse, sometimes like a human being, sometimes like a diva, sometimes like a mouth with lots of fangs and teeth. Years back when I was in Japan, I ran across a cartoon character called the Children's Police, a little tiny fat guy with an extremely malleable face. He seemed to be pure ID. Whatever emotion was going through him would change the shape of his face. If he was angry, his nose would turn into a gun. If he was feeling lust, his nose got obscene. Inside, we're not all that different. Our nose doesn't change shape that much as we go through the day, but if you could look at your sense of self, you'd find it changing shape all over the place, extending little pseudopods here or there. We tend to think of ourselves as just being us, which leaves us stuck with whatever us we find ourselves in. So it's good to see your sense of self as a fluid activity, and then ask yourself, how can I mold it in a way that's going to be helpful for long-term welfare and happiness? When you learn how to think in these terms, that's what eventually will get you to the point where you don't need a sense of self anymore. That's when you'll get to the ultimate level where you've found a happiness that doesn't need to do anything or require anything more to be done. At that point, self will have no more value and you can put both it and not self aside. But in the meantime, learn a good sense of values around self and not self as they apply to the path. Because having that sense of values will really help you on your way.